Nirasya sarva sandeham akikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurum Īśvaram. Itam Shri Radhika Nata Pada Sarojayo Yena Premanubhutyasha Dattam Tam Shri Gurum Bhaje. Shri Govinda Pararavinda Marupananya Bilashojitan Purna Prema Rasotsavo Jalamano Vritti Prasannananan Shashvad Krishna Katha Mahamrita Payora Shomura Kelato Bande Bhagavatani Mananunavam Murdnani Patyakshito. Namah Shri Guru Krishnaya Nirupari Kripa Krite Yashri Chaitanya Rupa Bhut Tanvan Prema Rasam Kalo Jayatam Surato Pangor Mama Mandamater Gati Matsarvasva Parambo Jo Radha Madana Mohano Adadanastrinam dantoir yacheham puna puna Srimad Rupa Parambojo Dhulisyam Janma Janmani Abhirapali Patiputra Kanta Dasya Bilashati Balashvavara Shri Rupa Chintamala Sapti Sangsto Matsvanta Durdanta Haiturastam Raganugami Bhajano Lasamanasanam Shri Radhaya Sahasara Smaratam Brajendhum Shri Rupa Pada Kamala Shrita Cheta Samme Chittam Satam Nirupari Madhukari Yatu Pada Padme Bhaktir ya nikidarta varga janani ya brahma sakshat krite anandatishaya prada vishaya jat sukyat vimuktir yaya Shri Radha Ramanam padam bhajayugam yasya mahanashrayo ya karya vrajaloka gurutara Premnaiva tasyai namah Yaram yanikidagha sangha shamani shrutratritim sangata Yasvadya rasikai sukabdi janani dhikarya mukti spriham Yadhyata hridaye vrajendra tanuja premamrita syandini Saji Yad Hari Bhakta Vrinda Mohita Dhanye Padyavali. By the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana the Swabhajana Vibhajana Prayojana Avatar Prema Purushottam Karuna Mahasagar Shri Gauranga Mahaprabhu and his beloved Parshad, the crest jewel of Gaudiya Vaishnava Acaryas, the fulfiller of his heart's desire on this earth, Sri Rupa Gosvami Pad. Again today we will continue our discussion of Padyavali, and in particular the conclusion of this section on Sotsukya Prarthana, discussing again today the fourth verse of Sriman Mahaprabhu's Shikshastakam, and likely today completing or nearly completing the discussion we have of that. So in our last class we spoke about Tat Kratu Nyaya, this principle of intention that we will ultimately achieve, however the mind becomes so attuned such that we desire a particular thing. So by being careful what we wish for, studying Shastras so that we can understand what is most worthy of wishing for, or being wished for, and then doing sadhana to make the mind one-pointed upon that object, singularly desirous of that. This is precisely what the path of sadhana bhakti by Sri Rupa Gosvami Pad is, as we demonstrated by references to the Durgama Sangamani Tika on various parts of Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, as well as statements in the Priti Sandarbha that drew upon various statements from various shastras regarding this subject of Tad Kratu Nyaya. So, today we'll look again at the early side of the verse, or in other words, in our verse of discussion, the first half of the verse states a non-ambition for things other than bhakti, and in the second half of the verse, prays for bhakti, or expresses desire for bhakti. So, we've spoken about why it's so essential to have that desire for bhakti, and why with that, it's essential to let go of all desires other than bhakti. But sadhakas typically experience that it's difficult to reattune the mind such that those desires fall away, and such that those desires for other things no longer distract one from the pursuit of bhakti. And not only does it take time for them to fall away, but there's also often typically a lot of, quote, cognitive dissonance, or instances in which we rationalize continuing to desire these other things. So that's what we're going to analyze today. So, without further ado, I start from the top of the fresh file. A common challenge faced by aspirants on the path of Uttama Bhakti is the tendency to rationalize one's attachments to wealth, people, erudition, and the like as being favorable rather than unfavorable to progress on the path. To understand how this arises, it is useful to first consider the influence of the third object mentioned in the verse under discussion, namely, quote, beautiful women, meaning objects of sexual attraction, since attachment is typically more clearly recognized as unfavorable in this regard, because the delusion it produces is typically more poignant than the delusion produced by attachment to other objects. A vivid elucidation of this can be found in the 11th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, where Bhagavan Sri Krishna recounts in the course of his teachings to his dear friend Uddhava the song of an emperor named Pururava, who became deeply infatuated with a goddess named Urvashi, but later recovered his discernment, or vivek, and deciphered the delusion he had fallen into. So this is an extended passage from the Bhagavatam itself. I'll forego reading all of the source text in this case, but it's there in the footnote for anyone who wants to refer to it. So Pururava says, or rather of Pururava it is said, he whose mind was attracted to Urvashi, so Pururava, did not notice the coming and going nights of the years that passed, as he was unsatiated, even after continuously indulging in petty sexual pleasures with Urvashi for many years. Eventually, Pururava said, meaning he reflected within his mind, "Aho, the extent of my delusion." So this is aho in the sense of lamentation. The extent of my delusion means, oh, I've become so severely deluded. Plundered by her, meaning plundered by her of my discernment, and sleeping through the sunset and the sunrise, I did not notice the sun or the days of so many years that have gone by. Alas, aho, my self-delusion by which this body of mine, that of the crest jewel of gods among men, so this is a way that kings are referred to classically, so he was a king, so he's saying, I'm a god among men, in other words, I'm an emperor, I'm a king, but he says, my self-delusion by which this body of I who am an emperor has been turned into a toy animal of women. So, or you could say like a pet. So, to be a pet dog is, culturally speaking, the ultimate opposite of being an emperor. So he's lamenting and saying, although I'm an emperor, I've been reduced to merely a pet dog. And why? By this delusion that I've undergone. For one whose mind is captivated by women, what is the result of knowledge? What is the result of austerity? What is the result of sannyas? What is the result of study? What is the result of solitude and silence? It all comes to naught. So these are rhetorical questions, means even if one studies extensively, even if one takes sannyas, even if one acquires a lot of knowledge, even if one observes many austerities, even if one lives in solitude, even if one lives in silence, if the mind is nevertheless still captivated by objects of sexual attraction, then one is not going to succeed, or one is not going to reach the goal that one wants to, unless and until that attachment is purged from the mind. Fie upon me, incompetent in understanding and achieving what is in my own interest, a fool who considers himself a savant. I, who even after attaining sovereignty, meaning the position of a king, have become conquered by women like a bull or a donkey. Even after many years, my mind-born desire, that is, the desire that is produced and arises again and again in the mind. So this is one way that kama is spoken of as atma-bhu, or sometimes also called mano-bhu, but this is, could be interpreted in different ways. The word atma, as we know, has numerous meanings. Some cases can mean self or refer to the essential, nature of one's own existence. So if the word atma here were interpreted like that, then we would say that this material desire is born of my intrinsic nature, which would imply that desire of any type is intrinsic to the self. Moreover, material desire is intrinsic to the self. This would be, from Jiva Goswami's viewpoint, theologically problematic, or it wouldn't fit with that, his siddhānta. So it's significant that not only he, but also I've given here in the footnote, Samipad himself shows that here the word atma is meant to be understood to be mind. In other words, desire does not exist in the atma itself. The atma has the capacity to provide the basis for which desire can arise within a psyche or a mental system. So it's only the psyche, or the combined element of the antakaran and the atma that creates the possibility for desire to emerge. So anyway, that's just some contextual discussion of terms in the verse. But what he's mainly saying, or he's stressing this point, that this desire that I feel, it's just arising in my mind, meaning it's not really coming from the objects that I'm seeing, and it's not really coming from my real self. So I shouldn't attribute the source of this desire to the objects that I see, and I shouldn't fully identify this desire as being mine, or that, quote, I'm having this desire. Where is this desire coming from? It's coming out of the mind. Why is it coming out of the mind? Because the mind has been conditioned by past sense experiences to have certain samskaras and thus certain vasanas. It's more or less mechanical. Because it has this data, it's producing these outputs. So I need not that one should consider it too lightly. In other words, the effect that it can have is problematic, so it shouldn't be taken too lightly, but at the same time, it also doesn't need to be a cause of, undue or extreme senses of shame or guilt or something like this. It's just how the mind is. There's no need to, identify it entirely. Although, if one has taken actions and continues to behave in the present that lead to the perturbation or the propagation of this state of the conditioning of the psyche, then that is certainly something to repent about and certainly something to take seriously. Anyway, we'll get into the import of these statements later. Let me just finish reading the main passage. So he's lamenting here. Even after many years, my mind-born desire to enjoy the nectar of Urvashi's lips has not been satiated, and rather has only increased, like a fire by oblations of ghee. Who else besides Adhoksaja, Bhagavan, the Īśvara of those whose satisfaction is from within the self, the Atmaramas, is able to free my mind after it has in this way been stolen by a wanton woman? No one, and therefore I should worship him alone. So this is the import of what he's saying. So he feels that I'm so thoroughly conditioned by this desire, and I've become so thoroughly deluded because of that, that I see no one who can help me out of this situation other than Bhagavan himself. Although I was advised by this goddess, namely Urvashi, with well-stated words to forgo my dalliance with her, the severe delusion situated in the mind of I of wicked disposition and uncontrolled senses did not recede. In other words, even Urvashi was telling me not to be so attached in this way, but still I was pursuing her, still I was acting on this desire and this attachment, even though she advised me against that. Since it is I who am of uncontrolled senses, what harm to me has been done by her? In other words, I can't blame her for this, or is done by a rope to a perceiver without knowledge of the nature of the object being perceived, who has it in mind that the object is a snake? None. So, if someone accidentally perceives a rope to be a snake, or accidentally perceives a scarecrow to be a man, or a dead tree to be a man, and becomes scared, is it the dead tree's fault? Is it the scarecrow's fault? Is it the rope's fault? No, you can't blame that on those objects. It's only, the perception that one has of those things. Or another experience I've had like that is some Prasadi marigolds piled at the base of a tree can look like a smoldering fire. But you can't blame the marigolds if you get scared that there's fire right in front of you somehow. So, like that, he's saying, I can't blame this woman for my being attached to the woman. She even advised me not to be. It's only my own mind that's the cause of me being so unable to control my senses or my behavior or my thoughts. So, we'll look at now some commentary and discussion related to these statements. As Maharaj Pururava in this way discerns the delusion that he fell into, and recognizes that Urvashi is not at fault for it, he addresses another assertion that can arise in regard to it. So Chakravarti Pad brings out this point. She alone is still the cause of your delusion because of her qualities of voluptuousness, redolence, sweetness, and so forth. So, in other words, someone could say, no, it's not Urvashi's fault, because the conditioning and the attachment is really just in your mind. It's not her, you can't blame it on her. But then here's the Purva Paksha, so to speak, would be, no, it is her fault, because even though the conditioning is in the mind, all these qualities are perceived to be in her, and it's not that he feels this type of attachment to every woman, he feels this attachment specifically to this incredibly beautiful goddess. So it is this particular object that is specifically has a causal role in me having this attachment, or me having this delusion. So this would be the Purva Paksha. Considering this, Maharaj Pururava further discerns, significantly, that the delusion he suffered from is not fundamentally caused by Urvashi, that is, the object to which he became attached, but rather by the samskaras, vasanas, and desires within his own mind. So now this is the reply to the Purva Paksha. If you say, no, because she's voluptuous and sweet-smelling and so forth, it's her fault that you're becoming attached and deluded. No, why not? So he says, where is that foul and impure body of Urvashi filled with bad odors and so forth? And where are the qualities of resembling a flower and so forth, which I perceive to be present in that body? The superimposition of those qualities onto that body has been done by me because of ignorance. Still, one becomes greatly attached to that impure body of contemptible fate, thinking, "Aho, what a fine nose, fine smile, and highly attractive face this woman has." So he's saying that actually the qualities aren't even in the body. In other words, it's only my own superimposition of those qualities onto the body that is the cause of my attachment to that body. So Chakravarti Pad, he elaborates on this in his commentary as follows. He says, "It is not so. That is, it is not that Urvashi is the cause of my delusion. Those qualities too, which I perceive to be present in her, are actually only fabricated by my own indiscrimination, that is, avivek. They are not really present in her, but rather a product of my own samskaras, vasanas, and desires. After proper examination, where is that very foul body, that is, her body which is made up of and produces foul substances and odors? And where are those qualities of resembling flowers, beginning with redolence, tenderness, and so on, and others in addition to that, which I perceived to be present in that body of hers? When the body in which those qualities were perceived is observed discerningly, it is understood that the qualities are not really in that body. Rather, this superimposition of those qualities onto her has been done by me solely because of my own delusion." So, if we look at this practically speaking, whether it's food or human beings or any type of object to which people perceive the quality of beauty, so to speak, there's the famous saying, "Beauty is in the eye of the beholder." So the usual intention of that saying is not exactly what's being said here, but we could think of it in that way. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. In other words, the delusion of there being beauty in the object is actually in the mind of the perceiver. So the idea is that, or if we look at this a little more finely, we can say that it's not that there isn't necessarily the presence of some of those qualities in, just as it's being said here, the body of a person who has a beautiful figure. There may be some attractiveness to that figure, but it's not that that's all that there is. In other words, that very figure which has, some attractiveness to its shape is also a source of many other things that are not attractive at all. In other words, foul substances or misbehavior or what have you. So that much anyone will agree to is that it's a mixed bag, that nothing that is, so to speak, perceived to be beautiful is 100% free from defects along with it. There's definitely defects that are inevitably present. then another point will be that whatever qualities are there are also only temporarily present. As beautiful as anybody may be, just fast forward the time machine however many years, and there's not that's not there anymore. Sooner or later, whatever was seen appears very different. So you have qualities which are inevitably mixed with faults. You have qualities which are inevitably transitory. And then on top of that, those qualities are not of universal recognition. In other words, someone might perceive a particular person to be quote-unquote beautiful, but in the eyes of another person, that person is not so beautiful, and someone else is more beautiful. So there isn't a universal standard of what is beauty. Beauty is subjective to the person's own sensibility. So that much people can agree on, that there's a subjective superimposition of this idea of beauty onto the object. So where is that sensibility or that sense of aesthetics coming from? It's coming from the conditioning of one's own mind. It's not coming from the object. So, if we look at it a little reductively, this much I think we can say without, sounding over the top. And therefore what Chakravarti Pad is saying on the basis of this statement in the Bhagavatam is not really a stretch. That certainly we have to accept that, in the world, not every human being is perceived to be as replete with as many qualities or, attractive features as others. There is some distinction in the nature of the objects, that we can't deny. But nevertheless, along with that in terms of anyone becoming deluded by and having excessive attachment to any of these things, that is entirely an affair of the conditioning of the mind of the perceiver. It's not that anything in those objects are inherently having some power like that, just as, between human beings, there might be some perceived sense of attractiveness, but that doesn't typically go across the species border. So, if, when cows are in heat and bulls are pursuing cows, that doesn't have any bearing on human perception. In other words, who's perceived to be attractive or not, this is, it's not that's, on the basis of the, a universal basis, but it's based on the conditioning of the mind of the different entities. And, if you look at it in a more scientific sense, so much of it is hormonal and, in one sense, just part of the chemical structure of the body. So all of these things considered, the overall point that's being made here is that one need not identify with that state of attraction as being quote-unquote coming from oneself. Moreover, one need not think that the things to which one is attracted are actually present in the object or the locus that they appear to be. And rather, one can understand that this is all going on just because of the way that the psyche is attuned at a given time, or there's this function of superimposition going on, and that because that type of superimposition is leading one away from a state of mind in which one is focused on a spiritual object, then that type of superimposition is understood to be delusional, or to come about because of delusion and to be unfavorable or unhealthy. So, after coming to this realization that not Urvashi, but rather his own samskaras, vasanas, and desires were the primary cause of his delusion, since not Urvashi's body, but rather his own superimposition was the source of the qualities to which he became attracted and attached, Pururava further reflects, on whether it would be beneficial for other spiritual aspirants to avoid meeting with beautiful women like Urvashi, so as to avoid falling into such delusion, or whether there is no need for such avoidance, since one would not fall into such delusion if one is able to avoid such superimposition. the conclusion he reaches is as follows. So if we say, oh, there's no qualities in the object, the qualities are all superimposed into the object by the mind, therefore there's no problem perceiving any of the objects. Therefore, classic, the things that people are typically become attached to or attracted to, they can just remain there, they can perceive them, they can be around them, they can interact with them, no problem, because it's all just superimposition in the mind anyway. Is it like that? Is it that because we recognize this to be superimposition and not inherent in the object, that there's no benefit in avoiding the object? So this is his analysis in regard to this doubt. He says, and these are statements in the Bhagavatam itself, even then, a sagacious person should not foster attachment to women or those attached to women. And here attachment means attachment in the sense of being attached or together. In other words, associating with such persons. So in other words, he's saying, better not to be around the object upon which one does this superimposition, or be in the midst of and converse with those who engage in such superimposition and speak so as to conjure up such superimposition in your mind as well. So he says, even then, a sagacious person should not foster attachment to women or those attached to women. That is, one should not gaze at them, and so on. The mind is disturbed by contact of the senses with their objects, and not otherwise. That is, the mind is not disturbed if such contact does not occur. Feeling does not arise from an unseen or unheard of object. Thus, the mind of one who is non-engaged with the objects of the senses is peaceful and still. Therefore, attachment to women or to those attached to them is not to be fostered with the senses, since the Shadvarga, meaning the six senses, even of the wise, much less of myself, are untrustworthy. So this is saying the mind, the senses are untrustworthy, meaning when and where will, as a result of perceiving these objects in which such superimposition typically takes place, will they again conjure up such superimposition, or when and where and again will that psyche again, have such a form of cognition based on such a samskar? There's no telling when, and there's no telling to what degree. So in that sense, quote unquote, the mind and the senses are untrustworthy. In other words, one can't be certain that even if one is seldom influenced by such thoughts, that they nevertheless may suddenly come up for any obvious or non-obvious reason. So better to preclude the whole dynamic from taking place. Sri Chakravarti Pad explains these findings of Pururuva as follows. Even though women are thus certainly repulsive, because of their bodies being made up of and producing foul substances and odors, as was described in the earlier verses, still men foster attachment to them. That is, still they do not refrain from superimposing attractive qualities onto them and then becoming deluded by those qualities. Therefore, he prohibits interaction that engenders attachment to women. Otapi, he speaks this verse. A sagacious person, artavit, that is, one who is discerning, however, still should not foster attachment to them. That is, one should remain afar even from the sight of them, since vishayendriya, that is, since the mind is disturbed by contact of the senses with their objects and not otherwise. An objection is raised. Well, disturbance of the mind of even a sage situated in seclusion is sometimes seen. So he's saying, okay, avoid the objects, remain in seclusion. Then the objection comes, but even in seclusion, still the mind can become disturbed. It's observed that even people who aren't, so to speak, triggered by observing this or observing that, still their mind sometimes thinks in that way. To that he replies, true. That also is the case. That disturbance is, but why? That disturbance is produced by a past samskar from seeing women. Therefore, he says something well-founded, a drishtat, that is, therefore the mind of a person who does not engage the senses in the object of women is still and peaceful. That is, therefore it is better to avoid creating those samskaras in the first place. And again, just in case anyone happens to jump into this discussion without having heard points we've made earlier in this book, or that we made in regard to the Asatsanga Prakaran in the Chaitanya Charitamrita, this is certainly not meant to be understood as just something that's quote-unquote against women or condemning the act of men looking at women or something like that, but this is all meant to be understood as discussion by means of upalakshana, wherein the reader recognizes that whatever the object being flagged by or referred to as, quote, women here is whatever is the object that's applicable in the case of the way that their own mind is attuned. So for a woman, it might be a man, or it might be whatever it may be in the context of the way that any particular person's mind is given to engage in superimposition. So anyway, I won't belabor that, but that is a topic that we've made clear in many cases before. So essentially the point being made is that although the qualities are not really in the object, although they're superimposed by the mind, nevertheless, seeing the object is still a way that facilitates or perpetuates the tendency for the mind to engage in this superimposition. So it's better to minimize the grounds or the occasions upon which this cycle can be further perpetuated. When one's interest is in purging the mind of such samskaras, such to the extent that one seldom and ideally as little as possible perceives those objects in a manner that relates to, sexual activity, and instead can perceive them without that being an element, or without that being without that coloring one's perception or one's behavior in regard to them. We hear in the case of, in the Bhagavatam, of Jiva Gosvami, who was, who happened to walk by women bathing nude, but this had no effect on him, or he engaged in no such superimposition, because he had no such samskar for doing so, because he was a pure Brahmagyani. So, in the case of someone like Shukadev, he's, so to speak, beyond the scope or susceptibility of such superimposition. So this also demonstrates that, the deluding element is primarily located in the mind of the perceiver. But while one is in the stage of sadhana, while one is aspiring for citta shuddhi, then one will do well to not make the process harder than it needs to be. So therefore, we can see in cultures all over the world, since antiquity, there have been arrangements for those who are pursuing spiritual ideals to have a lifestyle and to have a space or a role in society and a facility within society that can give them some shelter and some opportunity to engage in their practice without excessively or unduly having to, continue to have such exposure, so to speak. So this is something that, across cultures, across religions, has been observed to be of value. But at the same time, we can say it's not without its pitfalls. In the midst of that segregation, there can also be other challenges that arise. So those are also to be considered carefully. This is not the time to go on a discussion about that, but there are many points of balance that need to be maintained in that regard. But just specifically relevant to this discussion is the conclusion that although the qualities are superimposed, nevertheless, to avoid perceiving the object is in one's best interest. After coming to the conclusions thus described, that is, after becoming freed from the delusion he was in, by virtue of applying knowledge that he had acquired earlier in his life, to discern his best interest, meaning this emperor before, so to speak, falling in with Urvashi, had also received a lot of spiritual knowledge. He'd also had association with some great rishis and others. So eventually, although he went through this prolonged period of attachment and delusion, when finally he engaged in deliberation upon it and made reference to that knowledge that was stored in his memory, eventually he could discern why he had gone on for so long pursuing satisfaction and yet never found it. So thus he understood that it was in his best interest not to continue to try to find satisfaction in this way, but rather the sooner he could become detached from this object and this means of attempting to feel satisfaction, the sooner he would start to get closer to feeling actual satisfaction. So Maharaj Pururava thus left the company of Urvashi, realized Sri Bhagavan as the ultimate object of prema within his heart by means of bhakti, and gave up his body, that is, reached final beatitude. So there isn't a lot of detail given on that. This section in the Bhagavatam mainly deals with all the details of the delusion that he was in and how he discerned his way out of it. And then at the end it just says, and after that he did bhakti and he realized Bhagavan, in just one or two brief statements. So the purpose of the narrative is mainly to analyze how the delusion works. It's not making an attempt in that case to teach the practice of sadhana bhakti. That evidently is taught in many other places. And this teaching about Maharaj Pururava was taught by none other than Bhagavan Sri Krishna himself, near the conclusion of the Uddhava Gita. So, specifically noteworthy in this account, with respect to the import of the negation of ambition for beautiful women in the verse under discussion, as well as the negation of ambition for wealth and so on, also mentioned therein, is the description of Maharaj Pururava of the mind as, quote, untrustworthy, avishrabdha, and, quote, disturbed by contact of the senses with their objects. These statements apply to non-siddhas. Okay, I mentioned this point already, but we'll just hear it again. These statements apply to non-siddhas, that is, to aspirants on the spiritual path who have yet to reach a stage of ultimate and irreversible purity and spiritual attainment, since Srimad Bhagavatam also provides accounts of illustrious siddhas like Jiva Gosvami, who not only remain unfazed even after seeing naked women, but also create no sort of concern even in the mind of such women when they see him roaming about unclothed. For the vast majority of persons, who are far from a highly realized state like that of Jiva Gosvami, simply perceiving desirable objects of the senses creates a very real susceptibility to agitation of the mind, to distraction from bhakti and Bhagavan, to further generation of samskaras that give rise to further worldly desires, and to delusion, as was outlined in the aforecited statement of Bhagavan Sri Krishna in the Gita. So this verse we discussed earlier. For a person dwelling upon objects of the senses, in other words, by perceiving the objects. So the very process of falling into delusion starts with dwelling upon those objects, or perceiving those objects, or fixing the mind on those objects. Attachment to them is engendered. Because of attachment, desire is generated, and because of desire, anger is produced. Because of anger, delusion occurs, and because of delusion, failure of memory occurs. So this we see in Pururava's case. He was attached, and in that state of attachment, he entered a state of delusion, and in that state of delusion, he had a failure of memory, meaning he wasn't thinking about, it didn't even come to his mind, the knowledge that he'd learned early in his life that already had informed him why the path that he was following at that point was not a wise path. So when one has that failure of memory, because of failure of memory, loss of the intellect occurs. In other words, when you're not remembering those things, then your intellect is no good to you because the data it should be running on is not available to it. So when one loses the intellect, then one becomes ruined. In other words, then one wastes one's life. So this is what happened to him. Not to no end, but to a significant extent. In other words, so many years of his life passed in this way. While these psychological patterns are relatively commonly recognized in the case of sexual attraction. Okay, so now we're coming back to the verse. So the verse says, in the words of Mahaprabhu, that I don't desire wealth or people or beautiful women or erudition. So we've given this analysis regarding beautiful women with this specific example of Pururava because it shows what happens when you do desire them, then the extent to which the delusion can take over one's life. You can be a highly educated, brilliant emperor of the world and then end up acting no different than a donkey or acting no different than a dog. So even though you're highly educated, highly fortunate, wealthy, etc., even though you have the companionship of many wise people, all these things, you can lose everything, so to speak, or you can neglect to be benefited by all of it as a result of this desire. So in that way, it shows the extent to which this delusion can act over oneself. So that is you could say, a prominent example or a prominent way that shows this process. So the reason that was shown is to say that when one can recognize it in this way, then the more subtle ways that same dynamic plays out in regard to other objects is more easy to recognize. So that's the whole reason that this structure is given here of this discussion. While these psychological patterns are relatively commonly recognized in the case of sexual attraction, there is often less concern and vigilance in regard to the potential for wealth, erudition, and supportive persons, be they family members, followers, or otherwise, to also be sources of delusion and diversions from the path of bhakti. This is because wealth, learning, and supportive persons are often regarded as necessary or advantageous for progress on the path of bhakti. In other words, if some sadhu is seen spending time in private with a woman, then everyone thinks, oh, that's bad. But if this sadhu has a whole bunch of knowledge about all sorts of topics and a whole bunch of money and a whole bunch of followers, then people think, oh, very nice, very nice, very nice. So they typically don't realize that those things can be detrimental rather than advantageous. It is thus important to discern how and to what extent this is actually the case. Since Srimad Mahaprabhu would not express a resolve of non-ambition for these in the verse under discussion, if there were not a spiritually detrimental tendency towards them that needed to be checked in the mind of aspirants. In other words, why does Mahaprabhu say this in the first place? He's only saying this as a teaching, right? This is the Shikshastakam. So you only have to give a teaching when there's something that needs to be learned. There's only something that needs to be learned when there's a danger or a problem that's present. So the idea that desire for and the pursuit of and the time going into wealth or followers or learning that's extraneous to bhakti, that these things can be obstacles on the path, that's implied, in strong manner by the way that this whole verse is constructed. It is thus important to discern how and to what extent this is actually the case. Okay, I read that. That with the attainment of wealth comes numerous inconveniences and hindrances was explained in the aforesaid statement of Vritra to Indra from Srimad Bhagavatam. So we saw in the case of Pururava the detrimental effects of having desire for a beautiful woman. We saw in this statement of Vritrasura to Indra as he was trying to advise Indra, and we see in the case of Indra what happens to someone when they have undue attachment to wealth and power. So, for good measure, we also have more discussion of this from Bhagavan Sri Krishna himself in the Uddhava Gita. Bhagavan Sri Krishna in his teachings to Uddhava also recounts another inner reflection, like that of Maharaj Pururava in regard to women, which was reached by a Brahmana from Avanti in regard to wealth. So you might think, money is great, we should all just, having money would be very useful. So what's wrong with money? Or what's wrong with having any more money than you need? This is discussed here in chapter 23 of the 11th canto. So this Brahmana, who had, in the later stage of his life, accepted sannyas and walked away from his wealth and his family and so forth, this was his finding. Quote, in the earning, attainment, increasing, protecting, expending, loss, and enjoyment of wealth, human beings undergo strain, fear, anxiety, and delusion. Theft, violence, falsity, deceit, desire, anger, perplexity, pride, quarrel, or you could take it as treachery or disunion, enmity, mistrust, jealousy or rivalry, and vices. These are considered the 15 detriments or anarthas of human beings, the root of which is wealth or artha. So interestingly, if you look at it, what is being said here basically is that from artha comes anartha. How many? 15. 15 types of anarthas arise from artha, as were listed here. Therefore, a seeker of well-being should give up that detriment or anartha known as wealth, artha, from afar. So what you think is artha is actually an anartha. What mortal man, having achieved this human body, which is the door to svarga and liberation, would become attached to property, wealth, which is a dwelling place of detriment or anarthas? None. So why is even a learned person repeatedly troubled by meaningless endeavors for wealth? Certainly this world is completely bewildered by someone's maya. In other words, in this peculiar situation where there are so many troubles that arise from wealth, even learned people are still struggling to get wealth. Sri Bhagavan himself also states, as was implied by Vritrasura in his aforecited statement in Bhagavan 6.11.23, that to favor his bhaktas, he in many cases personally takes away wealth that is obstructive on the path of bhakti. Oh gosh. I've got to type, that's redundant, I'll just leave it at that. Okay. So he says two statements to this effect, one in the 8th canto. O Brahma, for one whom I favor, I remove that wealth by which a person becomes proud, obstinate, and disrespectful towards the world and myself. And in the 10th canto, near the end, he says also, I will gradually take away the wealth of one whom I favor. Then when he is devoid of wealth and troubled by troubles, one after another, his relatives reject him. When he will in this way become unsuccessful in his endeavors and disinterested in the pursuit of wealth, then, once he has formed friendships with those devoted to me, I will bestow my favor upon him. Then, after realizing in essence the Supreme Brahman, meaning me, subtle, purely conscious, eternal and endless, and becoming steadfast, one is fully liberated from samsara. So these are instances of Bhagavan himself speaking about or showing recognition of how wealth can be detrimental and prolong one's non-engagement or non-advancement on the path of bhakti. Now we'll also see later eventually, just to balance things out here in case this seems like we're hammering all on one side of it, that there is also the principle in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu based on the Bhagavatam of yavad-artha-nuvartita, or proceeding according to one's necessity, or as per what is conducive. So it's not that all the ultimate purport of all these statements is that, money is just inherently evil in every possible sense. There's also the principle that one needs a certain amount of support in order to engage in sadhana. So ultimately, the practical implication of all of this is that excess is very troublesome, but so also is an excessive dearth. So effort should be made at a careful and accurate balance. In other words, not too much, not too little. And we'll come to that in later discussion, but just to keep it balanced in case it might sound too strong here. But here, because in the verse under discussion, the whole point is na dhanaṁ, we're emphasizing the na in this context. So, Bhagavan Sri Krishna also states that someone who desires wealth from him in lieu of bhakti is unfortunate. That is, devoid of a samskara for bhakti, thus implying that those who have a strong samskara for bhakti would never pray to him for wealth instead of bhakti. So this is a statement to Rukmini. O Manani, those who desire wealth even after attaining me, who am the master, that is capable bestower of that and of the wealth of apavarga, that is final beatitude, are unfortunate, since that wealth is present even in hell, or in births in lower and hellish species and conditions, and hell is a good condition for such persons on account of their being fixated upon the elements, that is, on enjoying pleasures of the sense objects. So there's a strong remark. Might be difficult for some of the Abrahamic traditions to hear, that Bhagavan himself saying hell is a good place for those people. Does that make him uncompassionate? No, rather, the principle here is that people feel satisfaction according to the attunement of their mind, according to how they superimpose qualities. So even when you give someone what they want, they're not initially, rather what's good for them, may not initially be even satisfied by that. So in the case of people who are doggedly intent upon material pleasures and material wealth and material power and so forth, then he's saying, okay, have it then. I won't interfere with what you want. I'll give you what you want. So no doubt, as we've heard, Bhagavan also, in some cases, gives people more than what they want. He gives them what's actually good for them, and that's showing his compassion. But in this case, when he's saying hell is a good position for those people fixated upon those things, then this shows that there's a line, if you will, where if the material attachment is so intense that the person is not at any point going to appreciate or change by being given the opportunity to let go of it by receiving the association of sadhus and so forth, if it's too thick, so to speak, then okay, sit there in the thickness of it. And, gradually, due to the karma that the person will generate, they'll move out of that state eventually, and then later they can be benefited more highly. But if someone is not too thickly enmeshed, if you will, then more abruptly or more efficiently, they can be blessed with superior options, which they'll gradually learn to appreciate. So this is how we can reconcile those statements we made earlier with this statement. But what's noteworthy especially here is that to desire wealth, right? In the verse under discussion, Mahaprabhu is saying, I don't want wealth, I want bhakti. So now you have Krishna himself saying the people who don't want bhakti and want wealth, in other words, who do the exact opposite of what Mahaprabhu teaches, well, let them, they're good enough in hell, so to speak, to put it bluntly. So this is a strong remark, which shows, how profoundly significant it is what one desires, because how Bhagavan will treat you will change or, is influenced by that desire that one fosters. Okay, well, it looks like we're out of time. We almost finished our discussion, but I think I'll pause here for tonight. And in our next go, we'll come to the conclusion of this discussion of the fourth verse of the Shikshastakam. So today we've looked essentially at na dhanaṁ and na sundarīṁ to represent, along with them, na janaṁ and na kavitāṁ. So how desiring things other than bhakti, leads to no true satisfaction, leads to a state of perpetual non-satiation in which one ultimately feels desperate and realizes that one has taken the wrong path. And before one comes to that, can be so thickly diluted that they'll even forget what they were taught by their gurus or their sadhus that they met, or that they heard in the scriptures, or that they were taught by Bhagavan himself in the case of Indra. And when they're that thickly diluted, then there's really nothing for them to do but just remain enmeshed in those sensory experiences until their karma sweeps them into another condition. So better that we use our precious human lives to pursue these sublime spiritual experiences rather than only entangle ourselves in these things that are never truly satisfying and detrimental to ourselves and others. So I'll conclude here. If anyone has any comments, questions, corrections, or feedback of any other type, please feel free to share. Yes.
Pranam Baba.
Pranam.
Can you hear me? Okay. Regarding the dhanaṁ, what is like a healthy mentality to have about it? In the sense that that is not too far left and is not too far right. I mean, I understand what we've read just now. In terms of we shouldn't have it in excess, because obviously we do need some wealth. We do need money for our day-to-day living. But in terms of what we've just read here and the trap that we can fall into, how as sadhakas can we summarize is having a more devotionally healthy attitude towards dhanaṁ?
That's a great question. I think that's an art, if you will, or that's a skill or a balance that someone, as they mature and progress in their spiritual practice, can hopefully gradually acquire. And it's also subjective to individuals. In other words, what might work for one person might not be exactly suitable for another. And it's also reflective of the stage that someone's in. What one might require at one stage is different than what one might require at another stage. So, on top of that, climate, culture, national law, all these things also play a role. In other words, and historical context as well. If we think even of the Indian context, how historically there have been bhikshus and mendicants for millennia living on the Indian subcontinent, and we hear so many not only scriptural accounts of these things but historical accounts as well. There's no empiric doubt about that, so to speak. And this custom of vagrancy and so forth, and from a very broad perspective, we can say that that's something that the climate of the Indian subcontinent lends itself to. You don't hear about the same type of things like that in Siberia or other places where, there's a much harsher climate and a greater degree of facility is required. And in today's society, where social sensibility has changed, where standards of living have changed, the general sort of expectancy and normality of daily living has also changed, even those who in our society today are recognized as highly renounced persons still have many conveniences that persons centuries in the past didn't have. So all of these things combined, there has to, one has to ultimately make this whole analysis with reference to one's own internal state of mind. In other words, the whole point of all of this, right, is to always remember Bhagavan, to never forget Bhagavan, to be as absorbed in devotion to Bhagavan as possible. So what's wrong with wealth? In one sense, there's nothing inherently wrong with it. We see that, there are great Mahatmas like Dhruva and Prahlad and Ambarish and others who Bhagavan put in positions of having extreme degrees of wealth. And they weren't, at a loss for that, so to speak, but they could remain in the midst of that and their bhakti was not hampered. So, we can't say, oh, well, because, that happened to them, we can be like that too. No. That's for Mahatmas. So, as I said, the principle is yavarartha nivartita, to proceed according to the requirement that one has. So, how is that requirement established? One way of establishing that in one's own life is just by analyzing one's own capacity for mental absorption and practical engagement. If one, that obviously balanced with survival. In other words, one has to survive, and ideally if one can survive and have an ample or a maximum amount of time to engage and absorb oneself in enriching acts of bhakti, that's ideal. And so what amount of wealth is the right amount that can best facilitate that while also, sustaining their well-being and health and, ensuring that they're not breaking the laws of their country and subject to imprisonment or what have you, or, dangers from unsafe spaces and things like this. There's an inevitable trade-off to all these things. So one has to look at the reality of the practical situation that one lives in, and with the ideal of being as engaged as possible, then, try to carve out a lifestyle that works best for them. And it's not that even, quote unquote, making money is, something that's completely separate from one's spiritual life. In other words, one can still remember Krishna even while they're at work, or one can still cultivate the idea of honoring the presence of Bhagavan within the heart of every entity when they're interacting with anyone, whether they're on the job or off the job. So it's not that there's a complete distinction between, quote unquote, material life or, employment and sadhana. Rather, sadhana should pervade everything that we do, and we should understand and feel even a joy in cultivating that aspect of sadhana which is suited to all the different circumstances in our life or all the different roles that we have to play in our life. But if we see that we have plenty of funds to do that, and then we're spending time, engaging in activities that are unnecessary and essentially wasting our time and energy on things that don't really benefit ourselves or others spiritually, then we can reduce the amount of time that we might spend working or spend in related to monetary affairs. So, one can, be pragmatic about it and, analyze one's own situation and then try to strike a balance and, avoid greed, avoid, a sense of of being, at the same time of being like afraid of having too little. There's, the faith and the assurance that Bhagavan is our protector. Bhagavan will supply whatever is required when we, tesham satata yuktanam. No, not that one. Ananyaschintayantu mam yeyana paryupasate tesham nityabhayuktanam yogakshema vahamyaham. Where he says, I provide whatever you require, I preserve whatever you have when you're ever given to thought of me. So one need not live in like a scarcity fear mentality, but at the same time, one ought not be excessively reckless and unrealistic. And, that level of risk, if you will, may also shift over the course of time and the depth of one's absorption. But in today's society, maybe the last thing I'll say here, I'm just throwing out a bunch of different considerations on this topic, is that the capacity for people to actually genuinely be free-spiritedly absorbed in spiritual things without these kind of worldly concerns is not that high. The amount of social complexity that has come up in the amount of laws, the amount of the degree to which finances and money pervade how many aspects of human interaction is unprecedented in our society of this century in comparison to previous centuries. So, as times change, then how one can really realistically strike an ideal balance may not fit the, textbook examples from the Puranic era, if you will. Although, we don't want to in any way diminish idealization of great, Bhaktas who set great examples, or, the parikaras of Sriman Mahaprabhu in the social context in which that Leela took place. All of these ideals are no doubt to be deeply cherished and to be aspired to. But at the same time, we don't want to sort of feel like we're hopelessly unable to do what is described in these spiritual ideal examples, and therefore we're nowhere and we're nothing. Rather, will be a unique way to practice these principles of bhakti in every different social context in which they're given to be practiced. And as social circumstances, as technology, as everything changes with time, then, progressive responses to those unique social contexts will also take on new shapes. This is something, natural and inevitable, if you will. So we want to, get a good, clear sense of the principles and have a deep affinity for these ideals and have a crisp sense of what we desire and what we don't. And then, try to work that out in a practical and an efficient way in our personal life as we're able. And that will be unique to our personal living situation. Does that answer your question? Or maybe, give a little bit of food for thought?
No, that was very helpful. Thank you very much.
Okay. All right. Well, we can conclude there. We'll touch on that topic a little bit more in the last tail end of the discussion here. And then finally we'll come to a new section and there are a couple of verses left in this section, and then we'll come to the next verses. So I conclude here. Vaishnavebhyo namo nama. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Shri Shri Radhe Shyam.
Jai Shri Radhe Shyam.
Jai Jai Jai.
Jai Radhe.